So this is a really fascinating topic because it's really quite unique as a societal structure in the world, at least that continues to this day. So this sort of strange image here, I just typed in Anglo-Saxon England and thought this was quite fitting. So I wanted to go back to Anglo-Saxon England, which is the beginning of these guilds that all still exist today in the city of London, which is really quite incredible. So although it's not known for sure, there are some snippets of evidence and generally theorized that these guilds, which were seen more as trade associations later on, like the saddlers and the fishmongers and the barbers, they started with people going to their local church. Their local church was a real center point, especially in Catholic Christianity. And there they would have met similar people from their parish, from their local area, people who were doing the same trade, because often in these medieval cities, there was one particular area for one particular trade. And that from this arose these guilds, groups of different trades and crafts coming together with a religious background. So they still have religious kind of backgrounds, although you don't have to be religious to join, with a stress on charity. So they are still, many of them are solely charities to this day. They're not involved in their trade directly. Also, one important thing is that these medieval and Anglo-Saxon cities, there wasn't a uniform government who was paying for sewage works and paying for buildings to be repaired and paying for widows to be supported or old age people to be supported or orphans to be supported. And so these guilds functioned as that role, like mini governments within their own realm, not really for all the people, but for those people who joined their guild, at least directly, but they did charitable works. So all the way back in records from the 1200s, when records really begin with these guilds, they are doing charitable services, which they still do to this day. It's just a lovely image of one of the surviving Anglo-Saxon churches in Escombe, just to give you a sense of these kind of little buildings they were gathering in. So it's from this origin in these parish churches that these trade associations / charities / brotherhoods arose. This is a lovely painting by, I think it's Peter Bruegel, 500 years ago, of all of this panorama of medieval city life with all of these different trades all jostling in one place. So to go to London itself, London has always been a pretty central town, city even, ever since the Romans 2000 years ago. And Alfred resettled the walled city in about 900. And there's some evidence that he gave the merchants and the craftsmen certain rights and privileges to allow the city to become powerful again. If people have a monopoly on their trade, it makes it much easier in a way than having any old person coming in and diluting it, disorganizing it, offering lower and lower prices, giving bad quality goods, for example. So this was also one of the roles of these guilds, was assuring a good quality and a well-organized system for these different trades. Obviously, at the time, this was a really good idea, and it was still a really good idea up until the 1500s, when London was still quite small. It needed that close-knit control of all these trades to stop, a mass dilution. But later on, as London expanded, but the city of London remained small, it's now its own region, for example, within Greater London, it came under quite a lot of complaints because you don't need to have all of these little monopolies. They actually form a barrier towards a sense of free trade. We'll get onto more of these things a bit later. So they're called guilds because this is an old Anglo-Saxon word for money. So when these members joined this community, they would pay to join, which is still what some of the guilds do. You pay to join. This is one of the ways that they financed themselves and also still finance themselves today. The City of London, the guilds of the City of London, and the City of London itself, well, the City of London itself, it's not actually recorded anywhere in history as being founded on a particular time and day by a royal charter. It's called in sui generis, of its own kind. It's assumed to be a legal established body because it just goes back so far, which is really quite incredible. And evidence of this is William the Conqueror in 1066. After the Battle of Hastings, he came to London and he wrote them a special little charter, which actually still survives. Here it is. It's in the City of London archives. And he said, "You can keep your customs and rights as it was before me, and you have the right to pass on your family titles and your work to your sons and sons and sons." So he wasn't saying, "I'm the new king, you do what I say." He's saying you can keep your already existing privileges and the way that you've been doing things, London, separate from other places, and you have basically a kind of a free reign in how you do things. Assumably, is that the word? No. What's the word? Presumably, there was a kind of an unspoken deal where, yes, the city could stay, but William saw that these guys were fantastically wealthy. And so the agreement presumably was to finance the king for wars and such in support for their own freedom. And that is something that existed all the way up until the kings were still powerful. Charles I, for example, there was still this struggle between the monarchy in Westminster and the city. If the monarch needed money, then the city was a key place for that, but they often had these power struggles. So it's quite an amazing little document from 1,000 years ago, establishing the City of London and presumably the guilds and the tradesmen there as already existing. This is the rough bounds of the City of London in the 1500s, and it still is roughly this area. It's called the City of London, and it's a separate region than, it's kind of an autonomous district within Greater London itself. And the guilds are still an important part, a vital part of the running and the financing and the continuing survival of this little kind of strange little world. Also in the Magna Carta, King John writes in clause 8, I think it is, that the City of London can keep its ancient rights and privileges. So already in 1215, the City of London is ancient. And from the 1200s, we actually get records of guilds being royally chartered. That's the medieval equivalent of getting your company incorporated today. With a royal charter, you get legal status, you get officially recognized, and you effectively get a monopoly, certainly within London, of your trade. If the goldsmiths are now a royally chartered guild, then you are the goldsmith and the gold worker within London. In the 1500s, there was a list made of an order of the roughly 80 guilds that existed in the 1500s. There are now 110 guilds, and the top 12 were done, well, the whole list was done by the order of their wealth and influence and power. And these were the top 12, and I'll be talking about some of them in more detail. The mercers, drapers, fishmongers, goldsmiths, salters, ironmongers, cloth workers, dyers, leather sellers, pewterers, carpenters, armourers, cordswainers, coopers, plasterers, and needle makers. These still all exist. I mean, it's really incredible. Some of them go back to their first charter, you know, in the 1270s, so 800 years old, sort of legally. It's really incredible. So some of the earliest, for example, are the fishmongers. They had a monopoly on the fishing in the Thames. Of course, that changed over time. You know, trading practices eased and different companies can fish. I don't know how much fishing is going on now on the Thames, but for example, the fishmongers, they're still, or they are responsible for the Billingsgate fish market and have been for hundreds of years. The market's moved a few times, but it's quite amazing that they're still involved quite directly in their trade 800 years on. Oh, that's Fishmonger's Hall, by the way, which is on the end of London Bridge. So it's kind of like number one, the City of London. Many of these halls have been there for 500 or 600 years. Not all, but many of them actually own that bit of land. So different parts of the City of London are actually owned by the guilds themselves, which is part of their wealth to this day, renting out properties on that bit of land, for example. The Saddlers is another very early guild, royally chartered in the 1270s. This is their crest here with this horse with its saddles. So their job, these guilds, the tradesmen, the craftsmen in this guild, was to make saddles and bridles, ornaments, and the uses for riding horses. They still are active. They sponsor horse riding. They give prizes for equestrian events, and they support various other horse riding equestrian things. And the merchant tailors is another very early one. These were involved in tailoring and cloth. They have this pretty marvelous hall, which many of these halls rent out their premises for weddings and business dues. This is the hall inside the merchant tailors. Many of the halls got destroyed in the Great Fire of London and then in the Second World War. And about 50 halls are still left in London. Most of them built after the Second World War, but some are before. There were other guilds in England, of course. London wasn't the only place with guilds. Actually, most cities, most big cities in Europe had guilds, even worldwide. One of them is the Bristol Venturers. They were most famously perhaps involved in the slave trade. So that's their guild building still there. And one of the oldest guild buildings is in York, which is the merchant adventurers. So this word adventure is just people who venture their money, they venture their capital into foreign trade, into setting off for the South Seas or getting pepper and spice from the China Sea. So these groups were really important in expanding global trade, especially the global trade that entwined very closely with the British Empire in the 1800s. Another name for the guilds are livery companies. So when a guild became royally chartered, it had the freedom to design and wear its own livery. This word livery comes from, I think, something to do with free or something to do with owning something. I can't remember it exactly, but they love their liveries. So the different designs of their cloth. And this is part of the Lord Mayor's parade every November when they all process with the signs about what they do, all 110 guilds, from the earliest, the saddlers, up to people like the information technologists, the agricultural journalists, yeah, all kinds of guilds. More of the fancy clothing. So what did they actually do in the medieval City of London? So I've picked out a few examples from the top 12 just to make it a bit more focused. I can't talk about all 110, obviously. I wanted to start by mentioning about apprentices, because in order to join one of these guilds, which was of course very beneficial to your career in medieval London, you paid, a wealthy enough family could pay something like 50 to 200 pounds back in the 1500s, which would be some tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds today, like sending your children to a public school or university, a top university. And you would do an apprenticeship of 7 years. So for example, you were in the merchant tailors, you would do an apprenticeship of 7 years. And then after that, you would become a freeman of the City of London, which meant that you could trade freely in your own right, but you would be part of the guild. You would obviously then get many more business opportunities. Other members would pass on business to you. You would pass on business to them. You would look out for your brothers and sisters in this community within the community. You would also get a pension, your children would be supported, your children could then become members of the guild by right because you're a member of the guild. So it's really a kind of networking, trade association, religious charity, monopoly of trade, all mixed together into one quite particular development of society. One of the top ones, I think the top, is Mercers, the Mercers Guild, or the worshipful company of Mercers. This word worshipful comes from their religious backgrounds, that when they were founded by royal charter, they established, each of the guilds would establish themselves as the worshipful company of. So they're designing themselves as kind of humble servants of the Lord. So this is the Mercers Guildhall. It's just off Cheapside. It's on the site where Thomas à Becket was born, and they've been here for about 600 years. It's quite incredible, although the building is later. This is inside their halls, so quite modern building, but it's still quite luxurious. This is just an image of Cheapside. So they were really on one of the arteries, the commercial arteries of London. And the Mercers were involved in cloth, and specifically exotic cloth. So this Mercer is from the French mercier, and it became to do with cloth eventually, although mercier I think is kind of almost like groceries today. I'm not sure exactly. And so the word merchant isn't just anyone who deals with goods. A merchant was someone who would go abroad and deal with exotic cloth, and especially silk. So the Mercers were the people who were bringing in silk from abroad in the 13, 14, 1500s. And then their wives at home and the women of the guild and the women of the community would be working the silk. So highly trained apprentices and craftsmen would be working the silk into these beautiful ornaments that you could, for example, go to buy in the Royal Exchange set up in the 1500s, or many of the shops on Cheapside, which were selling these silk goods. Just an image of these women weaving silk. One famous mercer was Thomas Gresham. So it was he who founded the Royal Exchange in 1565. He was a member of the Mercers. He did an apprenticeship. He became a freeman of the city and a liveryman, so a member of the guild full-time. And he traveled abroad. He went to Antwerp, for example, in Holland, where he was a kind of spy, an arms dealer, and a cloth dealer. And in Antwerp, he saw the Bourse, which I think in French is still the name for a stock exchange. And this is a drawing of the Antwerp Bourse, which was one of the world's first centers for the exchange and the buying and selling of different commodities. This is before sort of stocks and shares, but that developed later. In the 1560s or 1550s, Antwerp was kind of sacked during a war in Holland. And Thomas Gresham realized that, Antwerp was the center of this commodity stock, so exchanging of these goods. It was a real kind of hub of all of this commercial activity. And he had the insight to say, right, well, now it can move to London. So he said to Elizabeth I, let's build the same kind of thing in London. And that then became the Royal Exchange. And the fall of the Antwerp Exchange is one of the reasons why the city of London became this center of global trade. And this, you can see the design still there in the Royal Exchange today from the Antwerp Bourse. Thomas Gresham, in the spirit of charity. So again, all of these guilds, they have a very strong connection to charity. Some of them are just charities. They're not involved in their trade anymore. I think the Mercers, for example, they're not involved in cloth or silk anymore. I don't think at all. So when Thomas Gresham, in his will, when he died, he said, "And I will and dispose that the mayor and corporation of the city of London shall give and distribute to and for the citizens and their successors to meet, to read the lectures of divinity, astronomy, music, and geometry within mine own dwelling house." And his house was just like this in the 1600s. And it was Gresham College, which still exists to this day. And they give regular free lectures and courses. If you look up Gresham College online, they have a whole YouTube channel for these lectures, and they're brilliant. Another famous mercer was William Caxton, who didn't continue in the mercer trade, although he did an apprenticeship in London. But with his wealth and influence from being a mercer, he noticed, I think it was in Bruges or Brussels, the printing press in the 1450s or 1460s. So he brought this idea of the printing press to London, to Westminster actually, and set up Britain's first printing press, which had a huge, obviously huge influence in society, of course. This is one of these early editions of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, printed by Caxton in the 1470s. Here he is showing off his printing press. So even if not directly involved in their trade, the guilds had a huge influence because they brought out people who were connected, who were wealthy, who were ambitious, who could be ambitious in a kind of big way. Yeah. I wanted to mention something about women because it can come across that these guilds are kind of just a gentleman's club for the very wealthy and privileged, and that the women are sort of swept aside. And it was like that for most of its history. Although these days there are women liverymen. You are now completely invited to be a woman in most of the guilds. I don't know about all of them, but I'm pretty sure most of them. But there's one quite famous woman that I heard about, which I found quite interesting, who was Elizabeth Pickering. You can see her name here in a book that she published in the 1500s. She was a member of the Stationers Guild, a guild that still exists, and they're still involved in printing and in ink designs, stuff like that. And she married, I think, 4 different stationers, and they all died, I don't think at her hand, but she became quite famous. And eventually she set up her own printing press as a free woman of the city. And she became quite famous and printed her own books. So it wasn't completely impossible for women to be involved. And nowadays it is very possible. For example, here, the Mercers, the new liverymen, but I should probably say livery people. Yeah. And the Grocers. So the Grocers Hall is just opposite the Bank of England, kind of tucked away, but it's quite a grand building once you get inside. And their coat of arms has these cloves on them, this spice, which at one time was quite a luxury spice. So the Grocers were originally involved. They were originally the Guild of Pepperers, black gold pepper from the East, from the Far East, was an incredibly valuable commodity. And they developed into the Grocers, who dealt in spices. And they became, of course, as you can imagine, very, very wealthy, because spice was kind of one of the main reasons for actually sailing east at all. It's quite amazing. So this is their hall here. Pretty grand. Yeah, developed from spice and pepper trade. They founded, in the 1500s, one member founded the Undal School, which is still going to this day, 500 years later. Another prominent one was the Goldsmiths. So this is an old engraving of their hall, and it still exists pretty amazingly to this day, Goldsmiths Hall. It's very close to the Museum of London. It's very opulent inside. I mean, you feel like you're in some kind of royal palace. They're one of the wealthiest halls around. They also own lots of land in and around London, which is a huge source of wealth as well. Some of the guilds also have large plots of land, some smaller, some none. So they're all very different in how they finance themselves. For example, they're very different in what it takes for you to join. There are basically 3 ways that you can join a guild or a livery company. Is a connection with your family. You can join through your own prestige. For example, you can you can know people in it, but also you have to bring something to the table. You can't just say, yeah, I want to join, I'm rich. You join bringing something to it. Especially now, they're looking for young, talented, qualified people to bring something to these guilds. You can also join, some of these guilds are connected with certain companies in and around the City of London. So there are various ways that you can join. Again, this is inside the Goldsmiths Hall. We get the word hallmark from the goldsmiths because they were in charge of assuring the quality of these precious metals like gold, silver, platinum, and also outsourcing the work for them to be worked. So yeah, it's quite amazing that this word hallmark comes from assuring the quality from these goldsmiths, because they had a monopoly for hundreds of years of all of the precious metals that were sourced and worked in the City of London. Ever since, I think it's the 1100s, they've been doing something called the Trial of the Picks every year. This used to be a very essential task of the goldsmiths. They would go to Westminster Abbey and they would check the quality of the currency. So they would take a sample of currency from the Royal Mint, which used to be in the Tower of London, and they would check the quality of it to make sure that the country wasn't kind of losing out with cheap, bad quality money. And they still do this. So it's kind of ceremonial in the Royal Mint today. Machines check the quality, of course, of the currency, but there is this ceremonial tradition which stays alive where they check the quality of the currency and also of medals and special coins that go out. So this whole thing about tradition and ceremony and heritage is really, really, really important to them, and to the survival of the City of London, because it constantly reinforces the role of these guilds in the charitable works and the networking and the support for this little kind of Vatican City almost of the City of London. There's even, talking about checking the quality, there's again a ceremonial role these days called the ale conner. I think there are 2 ale conners at one time, and they used to actually check the quality of ale. Ale was one of the key things that people drank. It was usually safer than water. And so the City of London had its own policies to check that the beer was good. It was a good quality. Again, you can see the importance that these guilds, in the real sense of kind of trade associations, the importance they had in controlling the quality of these goods. The goldsmiths, for example, in the late 1800s set up the Goldsmiths College. Sorry, I don't know the full name, which trained people in certain crafts and skills and still exists to this day. One quite interesting one I like is the Barber Surgeons. So this is the Barber Surgeons Hall, right in the northwest part of the city, just beyond the Museum of London. And it's quite a spectacular hall. It's got a tiny little herb garden. Part of being a surgeon was providing herbal remedies. But they're called the Barber Surgeons, not because barbers and surgeons are in any way related today. But I think before the 1700s, you would go to the barber and maybe have your hair cut, but also they would cut open one of your veins and bleed you, which was one of these, it was a key kind of medical treatment. I think it was George Washington who basically died, it seems, from being bled too many times. He got a cold and then he was kind of bled constantly to try and cure him of this cold. Anyway, so this was this barber surgeon connection. And apparently, I don't know if it's true, but I read a few articles on it, that the red and white signs of the outside of barbers is because of this blood connection, this red and the white. Of actually, bloodletting when you go to a barber. All of the guilds were, and I think most of them still are, connected to a particular church in the City of London. This one is the Guildhall's own church. The Guildhall is the central sort of ceremonial point of the guild, which I'll talk about in a sec. So this is St. Lawrence Jewry, quite a magnificent Christopher Wren church. But on quite a lot of the churches in the City of London, you can see outside their doors plaques. And if you read those plaques, it often says associated with or kind of honored by the Guild of Gun Makers or Carriage Makers or whatever it is. So that religious connection is still there. Again, even if you're not religious individually, it's a kind of a charitable thing. Many of the guilds are often supporting different regiments in the army. I went to a service. My dad is a member of the liverymen of the Girdlers. I'll talk about a bit later. And I went to one event at the Girdlers Hall where they were honoring the Irish Guards, and they also give money every year to the Irish Guards so that they can go back home to visit sick family, or if whatever it is, they have the funds to do that, which otherwise wouldn't be there. One example I quite like is the Firefighters Guild, who actually support a firefighting regiment in the army. This is their beadle. Again, I'll talk about the beadles later, but the beadles are these ex-military characters. Each of the guilds has them, and they announce dinners and they announce the ceremony, the order of the events of that evening at that dinner or charity event, whatever it is. The firefighters actually share a guild hall, because there aren't so many halls left, with the candle makers, with the Wax Candle Makers Guild, which is quite funny that these two go together into one hall. Not a good mix, literally, but a nice mix kind of ceremonially. Yeah, you can also get, so talking about the freedom of the city, it used to be in the medieval times, the freedom of the city was really, really, really important. This was the goal of becoming an apprentice, was that you could become a freeman. Today it's more ceremonial, and people who do good deeds or have particular influence in literature or science or whatever it is can be granted the freedom of the city. Every year, a few hundred people get this. There's one YouTube video, Stephen Fry gets it, and he does a little documentary about history of the City of London. You get this little plaque. And technically, this allows you to herd sheep across London Bridge, symbolically. And actually, originally, this meant that you are free to trade. You could take the sheep to Smithfield Market without being stopped. And then you say, yep, I'm a freeman of the city. These days, well, actually, since 2015, the Guild of Woolmen, they do this, taking sheep across London Bridge every year, I think in November time. But they do it for charity now. They do it to raise awareness for different causes. But they use that show and that pomp to keep going. So all of these different guilds and these different halls that still survive, they're all based inside the City of London, 110 of them. So these are the bounds of the City of London. Just a little bit about the city. This is its coat of arms here. Domine, dirige nos, God, guide us. It's one of the oldest autonomous regions in, not autonomous, I don't want to say democracy because it's not really a democracy. The oldest self-governed districts, continuously self-governed districts in the world. And its ceremonial hall, combining all of these guilds into the City of London Corporation, which is not really a company, it's like a government, and it's like the government of the City of London. So at some point in the past, these different guilds came together in some way to create a governing body, which would have an elected Lord Mayor. So this is different from the Mayor of London. This is the Lord Mayor, who is these days quite ceremonial, but does have, of course, on paper, the controlling power over the whole of the City of London. Part of the design for the Guildhall, which was built in 1411, so it survived the Great Fire of London and the Second World War. This front bit is newer, it's from the 1700s, but this back bit in design and the walls are all from 1411. To show their power, the guild's power, the influence for this building was Westminster Hall, which is another amazing building that still survives. And in design, goes back to the 1100s. It's the son of William the Conqueror who first built it. And I think it was Edward II or Richard II, sorry, I forget which one. I think it was Richard II. So in 1400s, expanded the ceiling and made this famous hammer beam roof. But it was this grand ceremonial place, Westminster Hall I'm talking about, for the welcoming of different countries, the royal seat of justice for the reigning monarch, all kinds of ceremonial occasions, which it still is actually for ceremonial occasions. So the influence for the Guildhall being that is a huge show of power for the guilds of London. Because of their trade networks, they also would have seen or known about places in Europe where the power of the city's authority, the city's government, was directly in the center, in the main squares. Siena, for example, the main palace in Siena, which is from, I think, the late 1200s. It's amazingly old. And in Brussels, this amazing town hall in Brussels. So they're the same kind of thing in London. But the Guildhall is quite tucked away. So this is playing into the British love of pomp and ceremony and surprise, that you don't get these grand Italian piazzas in England so much, but you get, you suddenly turn a corner and you go through a little alley into a little courtyard, and suddenly this building jumps out at you. So this is their design in this. Yeah, quite amazing how old it is. You'll see around London, around the city of London, the borders of the city of London, these dragons with the crest of the city of London here. This marks the territory of the region of the city of London. The red sword is to do with St. Paul. St. Paul had his head cut off, and so that's the sword of St. Paul. And then the red cross on the white background is the symbol of St. George, so the patron saint of England. And you can see that on many of the buildings in the city of London. If you look up every now and again, you can see this little red cross with a sword. And also on the street signs in the city of London, you'll have again this crest. You might be surprised to go out to places like Epping Forest and Hampstead Heath, and you also see these signs. What? Well, they actually bought Hampstead Heath and Epping Forest in the 1800s for the use of the residents of the City of London to use these open spaces and get out of the city. Up until the Second World War, the population of the City of London was actually quite high, in the tens of thousands. In the medieval era, it was sort of 250,000 or something in this little 1 square mile. But over the last 100 years or so, it became more and more focused on business. So now only about 9,000 people live there. Yeah. The guilds were also great sponsors of the arts, and they still are. Of course, part of that was their own prestige, to have paintings hanging in their halls. They would commission different artists to do this. And they have the Guildhall Art Gallery, part of the Guildhall buildings. It's free, and it's got quite an impressive collection of art in there. So this is inside the Guildhall itself. This sees many different events throughout the year. For example, the meetings of the 2 different governing bodies of the City of London, the Court of Aldermen and the Common Council. There's so much to talk about. It's crazy. Sorry. Okay. This is the hall, the Guildhall, and it sees lots of different events every year. This meeting here is every, I think it's October or early November. About 600 liverymen, so senior livery members of these different guilds, they come together for the vote and for the coronation of the Lord Mayor. This is just an old drawing of the Guildhall. So every year a new Lord Mayor is elected, and usually, certainly in the past, they would have been members of one of these guilds. They would have also had to be a sheriff of the City of London, who was directly involved in, actually judging cases. Nowadays, there are 2 sheriffs of the city, but they're mainly ceremonial. But the Lord Mayor is this kind of key central figure. It's unpaid, and so the Lord Mayor had to be a sheriff. He had to be an alderman, which is one of the governors of the different regions of the City of London. You can see it gets kind of complex, but it's not easy to become a Lord Mayor. So it's unpaid. You have to have your own funds to become the Lord Mayor. And it's just for 1 year. And then a new Lord Mayor comes in. And one of their main roles is to be an ambassador for the livery companies of the city, the guilds, and also for the modern day financial services that the City of London reinvented itself to offer from the 1950s and 60s onwards. Just to give maybe a context for you, one of the most famous Lord Mayors is Richard Whittington, or Dick Whittington. You know, this famous story about him trying to find his fortune in London and then leaving disappointed. And as he left, he heard the Bow Bells, ding dong, ding dong. And he came back and was like, yes, it's a sign, and then became this really successful mayor. Who knows if that's really true or not, but he was a famous character for being very, very charitable and a kind of good Lord Mayor. By the way, the City of London and the guilds of London, they got the right to choose their own Lord Mayor in, I think it was 1179 or something like that. Really, really early on, they're asserting their power and kind of gleaning more and more rights for self-governance over the monarchy. So London had this, and still has this, very privileged position in English history. And the City of London Corporation and the guilds are an enormous part of how they could do that. The Lord Mayor is now based in Mansion House, which is just opposite the Bank of England on Cornhill. It's just an old drawing of a vote for the Lord Mayor at the Guildhall. And in November, it's the Lord Mayor's Parade. That images I was showing you earlier with the companies, with the liverymen dressed in their costumes. This is for the Lord Mayor's Parade, when he goes around in a 300-year-old carriage made by the Guild of Carriage Makers, and yeah, kind of greets his new city. Also present are the Hamburger Morgensee. Maybe Sonia can correct me. It's basically in the 1300s, these cities in Northern Europe called the Hanseatic League, they were given permission to set up an enclave in the City of London. And so they're also present to honor that trade association way back in the 1300s. So I was talking about the two different houses, the Court of Aldermen and the Common Council. So I'm not going to talk too much about it because I want it to be more about the workings of the guilds themselves. But the guilds are very much tied in to the ruling of the City of London. So most of the aldermen in the past, you would have been a member of a livery company to be an alderman, who is the governor of one of the 25 different districts of the City of London. You would have had to be one of the guilds. I don't know if today you have to be, but certainly you have to be a freeman of the city to this day. So you have to have some connection and some show of both your own good nature, as in you've done something good for the city or for the people of the city to enter into this government. So it is quite a closed world, basically. And the Common Council. So there are about 100 members in the Common Council. And again, I believe that you have to be a freeman of the city before you can become involved in any of these two different houses. So the Court of Aldermen, 25 people. The Court of the Common Council is about 100 people. So it's a two-house system. And it's such a well-organized governing body that there's a fascinating article about how this two-house system influenced the two-house system of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. I find it really interesting because the City of London just goes back so far into history and could have been very formative in how British government developed on the whole. And it's still going on to this day. It's really amazing. These are the different wards or little districts within the City of London. So just in this square mile of space, there's this whole kind of medieval world, which is still going on. It's really incredible and very successfully. You may have read recently in the news that the City of London are perhaps going to be exempt from certain business taxes in the future, which again shows their power, their influence, how much the government wants to keep them in business, because they've had a kind of power hold on financial services, for example, and foreign exchange markets for so long. So yeah, this is the Guildhall and all the ceremonies that goes along with it. Another great example of the power of the City of London, the power of the guilds, who are represented by the Lord Mayor, is when the monarch enters the City of London, and they would have used to enter along Fleet Street under Temple Bar, which isn't there anymore. The Queen or the King would have to touch the sword of the Lord Mayor. And by touching it, he or she is not taking it out of the scabbard and demanding that they all are obedient only to them by force. But the King or Queen is saying, I recognize your power, and I basically thank you for letting me enter the city without trouble. And it's still done to this day. The Queen ceremonially touches the Lord Mayor's sword without sounding sordid. God, 2 puns, Jesus. That was all unplanned, by the way. So yeah, and every year the Guildhall gets a talk by the Prime Minister. So again, showing this how powerful they are, even though they're not anymore, people who are directly involved in gold or directly involved in saddle making. They are very much sort of quite powerful members of society, influential, I should say. In the 1630s, there's something called the Great Refusal, when Charles I and the government of the UK, they saw that London was expanding greatly beyond the bounds of the City of London itself, the old kind of walled area from the Roman times. And they said, will you please extend your authority to absorb the whole of London? And the City of London said no. So this is one of the main reasons why they are still this little tiny enclave, which has managed to survive many different attacks on it. People see it as outdated. They saw it as a conservative monopoly on power, for example, on their own trade. And they saw it as an archaic medieval system that needed to be dissolved. But it hasn't been dissolved. It has managed to, stay this little nugget of space and power and heritage in this growing London. A couple of examples about how the guilds are involved today. I guess one thing I didn't mention is that it's the livery men, it's the people involved in the guilds, and women now too, who vote for the Lord Mayor. Only they can vote. Only the liverymen can vote. The residents of the City of London, they can't vote for the Lord Mayor. The residents and the businesses, they can vote for the councillors and the aldermen, the people who will represent them in court, for example, in the decisions and the own laws that the City of London can make. So it's not really a democracy in that sense. It's a kind of very particular, it's almost like a business democracy, because only 9,000 people live in the City of London, but there are hundreds of thousands of business workers who have a vote. And the bigger the business, the more votes you have. So you can see why it's come under attack from, Labour governments, for example, because it is quite conservative in that way. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So yeah, the liverymen get to actually vote for the Lord Mayor. So this is the Girdler's Hall, and I really like it because it's this tiny little hall surrounded by these huge multinational companies and banks who actually pay sunlight tax to the guild, which owns this little bit of land and has done for the last 600 years, which is really quite incredible. This is the inside of their hall, and originally the girdlers were involved in making girdles, surprise, surprise, so ornamental belts. They would be the ones who would make the girdle for the monarch, for example, the coronation of the monarch, and they did for Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II, although they did for Elizabeth I too. And when a new king or queen gets crowned, they will request a girdle from the needle makers. I can't remember if it's a guild or a university who they sponsor today. So they're still very much involved in that aspect of the girdling, but not all members are girdlers. And today it's mostly a charitable kind of organization. About 14 million pounds a year, 14, is given in charity by these guilds. Yeah, because charity was one of the key kind of components of them. Here's me at one of the events at the Girdlers. They have this little garden in the background. It was a really, really fun evening. This was the Beadle. So the Beadles are these ex-military guys who are real characters. They have their own association within the City of London. And so when the dinner is about to start, for example, or the event, the prize giving or whatever it is about to start, they'll stamp their staff on the ground and shout, like really, really, really shout, like "Dinner is served, my lords, my ladies." It's really quite a spectacle. It's pretty awesome. And there are this ceremony called the Loving Cup. So in 976, King Edward was killed while he was drinking from a cup at a ceremonial event. He wasn't looking and someone stabbed him. And so there's this heritage, 1,000 years of drinking from these cups, which is a sign of, comradeship. And you're all sharing the same cup. But then when you get the cup from that person, so he'll turn to you, for example, and take off the lid with his or her right hand and hold the lid high to show that they're not going to stab you because their right hand is taken, if you're right-handed. And then you'll drink from the cup, and the other person will be standing with their back to you. So your back is being watched and no one's going to stab you from the front. And then this guy would then turn around, give it to her, then he would turn his back. Sorry, he would then serve her the cup, and then the person there would turn their back on her. You get it. And it's quite a fun thing that goes around. Again, it's just this amazing kind of ceremony and really old heritage. The Armourers Guild, which is really, really cool with their kind of the spear going through their lamp and this armor on the top. Here's inside their hall. They, for example, today they sponsor research into material science. So the kind of different materials needed in science. So again, connecting with their heritage of armor, special kinds of materials. The Horners, you can get the impression that it's all made up out of kind of bumbling old men, but I've talked to quite a few of them and they really, really, really want young people to join because, yeah, they don't want just to be old bumbling men as the sole members. The horn used to be the material used for everything. Horn was the cheap quality thing used for everything. And so the Horners reinvented themselves and started to sponsor and work with plastic, which is the equivalent today of what horn used to be. So they're quite inventive. The gun makers, who have been in this little building for about 300 years, they still test the quality of guns. And again, lots of old white men. So you can get a certain impression from these kind of pictures. But if you go to one of the parties, it's quite, or events, it is quite a lovely kind of warm, bubbly feel. Yeah. And the farriers, for example, they still involved with horseshoeing and horses. And they do an annual display outside the Guildhall in London of horseshoeing. The Shipmakers Guild, they offer apprentices for people to get into the shipping industry and to sailing. And after, I think it's only a year or two of being an apprentice, you then get a qualification and you become a freeman of the city. So some of these guilds still do these apprentices in their fields, and it's quite a movement within the guild to promote apprenticeships more. And inside the Barbican, which is also owned by the City of London and has its own kind of overseeing influence on it and what it's doing, how it's being run, there is the Guildhall School of, I think it's music and dance. So this is another one of the schools set up and funded by the City of London itself. And just before the Lord Mayor leaves his post in November, they have a huge prize giving for all of the different schools. So in the City Hall, they'll have this huge ceremony where people graduate. They're also really involved in science because, as I said, you know, people like William Caxton, who wasn't really a mercer for that long, but got involved in the printing trade. They had a lot of influence, and part of the effect of, for example, Thomas Gresham's talks and the talks that he sponsored from his house in Gresham College, the offshoot of that became the Royal Society, founded in the 1660s. Because of this scientific exploration, which was funded and sponsored and paid for from this original City of London guilds. And in the 1800s, late 1800s, 16 of the guilds came together and formed this charitable body called the City and Guilds of London Institute, which still goes on to this day, which has presence in about 160 different countries, and is about furthering education and giving apprenticeships and scholarships and funding new kind of humanitarian and trade resources for people. So there's really so much to talk about. It's really fascinating. That's it for today. I hope I whetted your appetite and gave you a good introduction. Yeah, if you have any questions, then please go ahead and ask. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed it.